I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss Zelensky's letter to Trump in an effort to thaw their relationship after Friday's shouting match, bringing the minerals deal back on the table. We also look at incoming German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and his plan to increase defence and infrastructure spending. Meanwhile, Trump has banned the UK from sharing intelligence from Washington with Ukraine. And Ukrainian soldiers threw a beehive after having run out of grenades.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 5th of March, 3 years and 9 days since the full-scale invasion began. I'm joined by my colleagues Dom Nicholls, Associate Editor for Defence, and Francis Dearnley, Executive Editor for Audio. And today we also have war journalist Tom Mutch, whom you've heard on this podcast before. But first, over to Dom for the major battlefield developments.
Well, hello, Adélie. Hello, everybody. There's been virtually no movement on the ground in the last 24 hours. Tiny adjustments only to the line, which obviously doesn't indicate fairly the ongoing violence happening on the ground, including in a bizarre video posted on Telegraph, the use of a beehive in the anti-personnel role. So Ukrainian forces said to be fighting in the vicinity of Pokrovsk were said to have run out of grenades with which to attack Russian forces fighting from a cellar. So they picked up a nearby beehive and threw it in the hole. Footage is on our website if you really need to see that. Otherwise, very few deaths and injuries, thankfully, across Ukraine. Single figures only. 181 drones, 3 Iskander ballistic missiles and 1 S-300 missile fired at Ukraine. Most failed to cause harm. Russia continued to target an energy facility in Odessa Oblast overnight, the 4th Russian attack in 2 weeks back on Odessa Oblast's power grid. However, up in Kursk, Russia retook a little bit more land in Kursk Oblast on the northeast side of the Ukrainian-held lodgement. It's a smaller loss than that over the weekend, but that flank, the northeast flank, does seem to be under extreme pressure right now as Putin desperately seeks to clear out the Ukrainian forces ahead of any peace negotiations. And speaking of which, Donald Trump said last night that he had received a letter from Volodymyr Zelensky signalling Ukraine was ready to sign the rare earth minerals deal. Now, that may reverse the pause that had been announced in the supply of US weapons to Ukraine, could well turn the taps back on. More on that and the diplomatic side from Francis shortly. But let's just pause, because things are moving so fast, and have a look at that potential pause in weapon supplies. Now, we don't know the effects on the weapon supply issue of last night's announcement by Donald Trump. President Zelensky said he will return to the mineral deal and work under, interesting choice of word, but probably necessary given the ego involved, work under Trump's leadership. To recap, the US has given more military aid to Ukraine than any other supporters, which obviously includes the whole of Europe, but the US has not given as much in pure humanitarian, i.e. cash terms. Now, overall, taking money and military aid, overall Europe has given very slightly more. Now, that is correct, but also totally irrelevant, as the loss of any US support, or the loss of total US support that's being mooted, without a substantial uplift from Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and others, would have a great impact. There are signs, talks, promises of more coming from the countries on that list, but I'm afraid it is shit or get off the pot time. Roll on Thursday and the EU summit, when all eyes will be on Ursula von der Leyen, if that's not too disrespectful an image to conjure up. Anyway, to take stock of what any pause in US support might mean, the Institute for the Study of War has been crunching the numbers. They say it will likely take from weeks to months for the suspension of US aid to affect the front line. And they remind us that Western officials estimated late last month that Ukraine will be able to sustain its current pace of operations until about June this year, as long as the aid contracted under the Biden administration continues to flow on the previously anticipated timelines. Now, they highlight that it's the sophisticated systems like Patriot air defense batteries and long-range rocket and missile systems such as HIMARS and ATACMS that are the most vulnerable if the US turns off the taps. And they cite a Ukrainian official's words to CNN yesterday that any suspension could see Ukraine running out of US-provided artillery shells by May or June 2025, and that Patriot air defense missiles could be gone, quote, in a matter of weeks. Now, the ISW assessment is that as Ukraine runs short on Patriot missiles, Kyiv will have to make difficult decisions about which population centres to prioritise in terms of air defence protection. If it runs out of Patriots entirely, then Ukrainian cities will obviously lie open to Russian ballistic missiles. So, just to finish off, number one, we don't know if the rest of the military aid promised by the Biden administration will be sent if Trump's pause goes ahead. Number two, we don't know if last night's events means the pause has been cancelled. Number three, we do know that any cessation in the provision of air defence will mean civilians in Ukraine will be under greater threat and more will probably die than would have been the case otherwise. I leave it up to you to decide if it is Zelensky's or Trump's hard-headedness that has brought that situation about. OK, next one, Adélie. There are reports today in the UK that Donald Trump has banned Britain from sharing intelligence from Washington, as in intelligence that was derived, that was raised in by US agencies, sharing that intelligence with Ukraine. I don't often take my news from the Daily Mail here in UK, but Mark Nicholls is a mate of mine. He's not a total lunatic. And he says that all UK intelligence agencies and military outlets have received an order from the US expressly forbidding the sharing of US-generated intelligence, previously known as REL UKR, short for Releasable to Ukraine. That's a fairly standard convention, the REL bit. Now, responding to that, Liberal Democrats defence spokesperson Helen Maguire, now they're not in power obviously here, they're not the opposition, but they are the third biggest party by seats at the moment, if not polling. Helen Maguire, former soldier in the Royal Military Police, said Trump's decision to block the UK from sharing American intelligence with our Ukrainian allies is callous and short-sighted. He's putting the rug from beneath the feet of the courageous Ukrainian soldiers defending their country while emboldening Putin further. She said British Defence Secretary John Healey needs to raise this matter urgently with Pete Hegseth on his visit to the US it starts today, and I think the main meetings are tomorrow. Anything less, she says, will result in more Ukrainian deaths at the hands of Putin's brutal war machine. Now, I mentioned Ursula von der Leyen earlier in reference to Thursday's big EU Defence and Security Summit. Now, ahead of that, Friedrich Merz, who's Germany's likely next Chancellor, he's still putting the coalition together, but he's almost certainly going to be the next Chancellor. He's made a move already. Last night, he said he wants a defence aid package for Ukraine worth about €3 billion, 3.2 billion US dollars, approved by the current outgoing German Parliament. Now, Miguel Berger, who's Germany's ambassador here in the UK, he tweeted last night, Germany's massive spending package for infrastructure and defence, an extra €500 billion over the next 10 years, and all the defence spending over 1% GDP to be exempt from the debt brake. Now, trying to make sense of that, Germany's finance minister, Jörg Kukies, said all expenses in our defence budget above 1% of GDP will be exempted from our national debt brake. Hypothetical example, he goes on. Were NATO to decide that defence expenditures increase to 3%, then 3% minus 1% equals 2%. Thanks for that, Jörg. 2% of GDP would be exempted. Current GDP equals 4.4 thousand billion euro, so 88 billion would be exempted. 1%, i.e. 44 billion, would still count towards our debt brake. Now, look, I've got an economics A-level, but all that sounds like mumbo-jumbo to me. I'm guessing it's a good thing, and please let me know if I've got that wrong. But Adélie, just to finish off, it sounds like Germany's Wende has finally zeitened. And I really do need to take a pause there.
Yes, I've not taken A-levels in either economics or German, so I will leave this with you, Dom. Francis, do you want to give us the latest on the politics side?
Thanks, Adélie. German economic history was a bane of mine at university, so I'm not going to touch that one with a barge pole. Let's start with a little more detail on President Trump's address to the joint session of Congress yesterday. In a speech where at times he was heckled by Democrats, the most relevant part for our purposes was when he said he had been given a letter by President Zelensky. "I appreciate that he sent this letter," he said. "Just got it a little while ago." He then began reading it out loud. "We really do value how much America has done to help Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and independence. Regarding the agreement on minerals and security, Ukraine is ready to sign it at any time that is convenient for you." So it seems the mineral deal is back on. Trump also said he's spoken to Russian officials who signal that they do want to secure a peace deal. To quote Trump, "Simultaneously, we've had serious discussions with Moscow and have received strong signals that they are ready for peace. Wouldn't that be beautiful? It's time to stop this madness," he said. Now, a few hours before the speech, after a conversation with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Zelensky posted a statement where he praised the US president's strong leadership and described their argument as regrettable. He was also said that he was ready to negotiate and would also countenance a ceasefire in the sea and the air. Now, the context behind this is we understand there's been an intense diplomatic effort by Britain, France and Ukrainian allies in Washington to resurrect the deal and just try and soften the White House's hostility, if it can. Now, clearly, Zelensky's overtures here are designed to do the same. It is helpful politically for Trump to think that the Ukrainians are not opposed to negotiations point blank, even if those negotiations saw certain irreconcilable differences between Ukraine and Russia, and ultimately the negotiations fell apart. Now, just on that point, because I think it bears repeating, if you're looking for clear-eyed and insightful summary of where we are on this question, Andrei Zagoronyi, chair of the Center for Defense Strategies and Ukraine's defense minister from 2019 to 2020, has written an interesting piece called Ukraine Without America, How Kyiv Can Persist in the Face of a Hostile Washington. Now, he has basically argued in this piece what many have been saying at the moment, but he's done so, I think, in a very concise and persuasive way. So to quote him, "Demanding unconditional acceptance of the terms pushed on Ukraine would mean that it would come on terms written in Moscow. For Ukraine, making it effectively capitulation. Kyiv would face a stark choice, capitulation or continuing to fight without its key ally. Yet the Ukrainian leadership, with the overwhelming support of the Ukrainian people, long ago decided that surrender was not an option, a commitment reinforced by the experience of the occupied territories. Everywhere Russia has prevailed, terror, lawlessness and destruction have followed. But even as the US pauses military aid, Ukraine's war effort will not suddenly collapse despite the significant challenges a prolonged freeze would impose. As long as strong European support continues, which seems even more likely after this week's gathering of leaders, Putin will be able to achieve some tactical breakthroughs, but will not reach his maximalist objectives." He goes on, "The only way to bring Russia into serious negotiations or to compel it to halt its aggression and accept a de facto ceasefire, which would allow European peacekeepers or a porcupine Ukraine, would be to present it with severe consequences for continuing the war. The Trump administration seems to believe that Russia would agree to halt its aggression and end the war without new pressure or Ukrainian capitulation. Yet even if Ukraine were to accept a settlement on Russian terms, it would not lead to genuine peace. Zelensky's consistent demand for security guarantees alongside a ceasefire should not be dismissed as just a political stance. It is based on the real risk that Russia would use any pause in hostilities to prepare for its next offensive. Russia would be able to accumulate a critical mass of capabilities and prepare for a new large-scale strike, one more dangerous than the invasion in February 2022. Russia would be able to suppress air defences, control airspace, and disrupt critical infrastructure, and it would likely avoid repeating the mistake of spreading its forces too thin. So a really interesting piece which lays it all out, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes. Now, we're going to do a deeper dive into the rapidly evolving German position later this week, which Dom was just summarising. I think I will just quote, though, from Friedrich Merz, one other thing he said as part of that announcement, and it was, "In view of the threats to our freedom and peace, to the whole continent, the rule for our defence now has to be whatever it takes." This is a massive, massive shift, suffice to say. Now, last story, we are inevitably focused on Ukraine and the European theatre, but Trump's foreign policy shifts and sabre-rattling have, as we've discussed, led to quite considerable alarm further afield. Thanks to everyone who's written in from Australia following my request yesterday. Thanks to Matthew, who said the war in Ukraine has largely fallen off the media map in Australia until very recently. To Douglas for his view that most Australians are horrified by Trump's betrayal of the long-standing allies of the US. And to Andrew, who agrees, saying that political support for Ukraine and the view that Kyiv was the victim of an unlawful and immoral Russian aggression is the bipartisan view in Australia. Thanks too to Jesse, who comments on the reports we discussed recently that Chinese warships sailed closer to Australia than ever before, conducting live firing exercises along the way. As you write, Jesse, if this was a coincidence vis-a-vis developments in Europe, the timing was certainly impeccable. I agree. And just to end my section on China, Beijing has said it is ready for war with America as it raises defense spending and imposes retaliatory tariffs on US imports. The US has hit China with 20% tariffs in response to what the White House considers to be Chinese inaction over the flow of fentanyl into America. Beijing has responded by announcing plans to boost defense spending by 7.2% and to hit the US with reciprocal tariffs of 10 to 15% on certain imports from March 10th. In a direct threat to Trump, China's representatives in America said, "If war is what the US wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end." This is pretty typical rhetoric to come out of Beijing. But nonetheless, in this increasingly febrile environment, I think it's worthy of note. But that's where we are, Adélie.
Thanks, Francis. And now we're pleased to welcome back to the podcast freelance journalist Tom Mutch, who joins us live in the studio with the boys. He's not in the front lines in Ukraine, but with us. Tom, welcome to London.
Cheers. Thank you so much for having me on. It's really great to actually be in the studio and get to meet everybody face to face.
So what can you tell us about the Ukrainian contingency planning for the current situation with the US pausing aid?
Okay, so I think it's important to go back now and look at the situation that prevailed between about late October, early November 2023 and April 2024, when Ukraine was cut off from a lot of US aid for about 6 months, when that supplementary package of $60 billion or whatever it was sitting in the US Congress sort of hostage to interminable domestic political debates in the United States. This was a real wake-up call for Ukraine because it said, look, the US is not necessarily a reliable partner. It's a very important partner, but it is not one that you can necessarily base your entire military contingency plans on. So, within Ukrainian corridors of power, and this is fairly well known to anyone who covers Ukraine, there was a lot done to basically reinforce domestic internal production by Ukraine, and it was mainly focused around drone technology. So this was really the period when drone technology went from, I don't know, being responsible for maybe, and these are slightly spitballing figures, from maybe about 30% back in 2023 to getting up towards 70% as it is right now on the battlefield. Now, to just give you an idea, an artillery shell can cost a couple of £1,000, and you need an extraordinary bloody big gun to be able to fire it. You can make a drone that can take out infantry or it can take out an armoured vehicle with a couple of $100 and basically a small amount of explosive that you can just pack into. Look, I know one guy who packed the explosive into a Pringles can, put it on the drone, and sent that drone towards a BMP. So the Ukrainians basically developed a lot of low-cost countermeasures to a lot of what the Russians have. And this didn't just apply to the drones that we've typically seen on the battlefield as well. This was also drones that could be used in the sea. That's why they've been able to deny the Black Sea Fleet so much access. That's why the Black Sea Fleet is now almost a negligible player. Now, to continue that, also, one of the biggest problems that we have is actually in the realm of air defence, because the Patriot missile system, which is the most powerful air defence capability that the Ukrainians have access to, is more or less supplied by the good graces of the US. Now, that is, as Francis said before, the only thing that can take down ballistic missiles, and if the Ukrainians run out of interceptors, that would be very bad indeed, particularly for Ukraine's civilian population. However, it would not necessarily have that major of an impact on the front line. Finally, the Europeans, after a lot of pleading and prompting, and also I do think there's this narrative sometimes that, the Europeans never really got their act together. That's only really true, to be honest, of Western Europe. Eastern Europe has really gotten its act together. Poland has increased its military spending, I don't have the figures to hand, but an extraordinary... Exactly, to up to 4.7%, and is now has long been one of the biggest suppliers for Ukraine. During that period where Ukraine had little access to US artillery, it was the Czech Republic and their initiative that were really responsible for backfilling a lot of the Ukrainian ammunition deficit. And if you look at by GDP, the biggest supporters of the Ukrainian war effort, it's normally considered to be the Baltic states. Now, it's because these countries actually really have so much skin in the game. They know that Ukraine is their shield, and if their shield breaks, the Russians could be the ones that come for them next. And now that the US is really bringing its NATO credibility and the credibility of Article 5 deterrence into question, they are really thinking that the time to support Ukraine absolutely to the hilt is right now. And one last thing is that the Biden administration were aware that this was a significant possibility, and so they really rushed as much aid to build up Ukrainian artillery stockpiles as possible within those last couple of months between the transition period. So Ukraine is expected to have a sort of a backfill of artillery for, I've seen different estimates, but probably between 3 to 6 months is a good way of looking at it.
Do you think there'll be enough for the western part of Europe to get its act together and come to help at that point?
Well, I am thinking that we're finally at the point where Western Europe has gotten the message, and I think the signals that are coming out from European leaders do suggest that they are taking this fairly seriously. Everything from Friedrich Merz, who is quite popular in Ukraine now, because Olaf Scholz, look, for all of the support that Germany did give Ukraine, he was considered as someone who just didn't get it. He didn't get he would say things that would come off very badly in Ukraine. Particularly one thing that's still remembered is when he was talking about giving Leopard tanks for the counteroffensive, being told, there would be a moral or ethical disaster with seeing German tanks on the battlefield, and because of Germany's World War II history and sort of things that were seen as absurd moralistic nonsense. Even though those tanks didn't go through, it was just more evidence that this is a guy who really understands the situation. The same with the restrictions on Taurus missiles, which I think it's believed that Merz will overturn, although I'm not sure that's been officially confirmed yet. I also think it's important as well that Britain and France have strongly suggested that they're going to put actual skin in the game. Whatever you think of Keir Starmer, whatever part of the political spectrum you're on, if you support Ukraine, the announcement that he is willing to send British troops to patrol a potential demilitarised zone or a frozen line of conflict. That's important. That's real skin in the game for the UK. And I believe Macron has indicated he would do the same. So I think the signals are reasonably positive and people have finally gotten their act together. 3 years too late, maybe even longer. I actually remember I was at a talk in Prague where the Czech president said, look, the first Trump administration should have been that wake-up call, but we didn't listen to it because we didn't listen listen to the message because we didn't like that message. It's now time to get our act together, and I think we're finally there.
Yes, Macron is giving a speech on the French television tonight at 8, so it'll be interesting to see what he comes up with and what he wants to say to the French people in terms of announcements, probably regarding this. Now, going back to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian population, what is the morale over there, especially with the US withdrawing all the military support? For us, when we were there in November, and now that is a very long time ago, everyone we talked to was very keen to keep on fighting. And there's an element of morale here that is being underappreciated by the rest of the world. Is that something you agree with?
Yes, that's definitely true. I would add a slight nuance to that situation, because there has been almost for a while, there has been a difference between they're willing to fight on, but they're willing to fight on for what? There is still a portion of the Ukrainian population, and a lot of these people exist in the military, who say, we're willing to fight till the end, till Russia collapses, and we can reclaim Crimea and Donbass and things like that. There are still people who are saying, we want to fight towards the very end. Now, I would say the more common expectation in Ukrainian society now is that is not going to be militarily likely in the foreseeable future, really. And so there is a little bit of a difference, because there are Ukrainian people who will say now, and it's honestly at this point it's probably a plurality, if not an overall majority, who say, look, we're willing to accept a ceasefire along the current contact lines as long as we have proper guarantees that this is not just going to flare up again in another 5, 10, 20 years. Now, I think when I go back to security guarantees, and this is, again, one of the real irritations that Ukrainians have with President Donald Trump and the way he's talked about this conflict, is that, again, he's seen as someone who doesn't get it. He doesn't get, for instance, he says, look, the only security guarantees we need are my word. Putin will give me my word, and, he knows that I'm going to come down hard on him and stuff like that. Now, even if we take that as a given, let's just pretend that's true for a moment. Trump's not going to be in office in 4 years from now. Even if Trump and Putin have this great bromance, what is to stop the Russians from just waiting another 4 years? And so everybody in Ukraine effectively says something like, look, we accepted a ceasefire in 2014, the Minsk Accords. Now, there's a whole number of reasons, honestly, on both sides, as for why those didn't pan out the way they should have, or one of the problems was that Ukraine negotiated them under a lot of duress, but that's really an argument for another day. But the overall point with the Minsk agreements was that the Ukrainians are like, we agreed to a ceasefire. 8 years later, they came back and they used the territories that they had taken in 2014 as launching pads to attack the rest of Ukraine. So it's like Ukrainians gave up Crimea effectively without a fight. They were dissuaded by Western NATO allies from putting up a fight for Crimea. Crimea was then used 8 years later as the launching board to take another large tranche of Ukrainian territory. And so no one wants to be like, okay, we're going to put the ceasefire line here now, and then in 8 years' time, the Russians are going to use their positions in, let's say they have Pokrovsk at that time, as a springboard to attack Dnipro, or they're going to use their positions in southern Zaporizhia to attack the city of Zaporizhia. So I think that's broadly where we are in terms of morale. And I will just make one slight additional point when we're coming to morale. Morale on the military side of things has improved fairly significantly recently. I think, when Dom was talking before about how there's no real news to speak of on the battlefield, this really is a case where no news is good news, because it is actually one of the first times in a long time that the Russian rate of gain has been slowing down. Their casualty rates increased significantly last year, and we've shown they show no signs of slowing down. How it seems like even those extraordinary casualty rates are not enough to keep gaining territory at the level. And also, the Ukrainians have actually been able to make counterattacks that have taken back territory. Not large amounts of territory. We're talking positional improvements to the front line in Pokrovsk. We're talking the possible, and it's too early to say for sure, but the possible encirclement of a number of Russian forces in Toretsk, which was thought to be lost. These are the first real signs of progress, with the exception of the Kursk salient, which I think is a different story, of Ukrainian battlefield gains on the recognized territory of Ukraine for a while. So there is a sense that the military position is sustainable and that does give them hand and leverage in coming negotiations.
You're writing a book at the moment about the war, and you were telling us about that you just wrote a big chapter on the Battle of Chernihiv in February 2022, which was, in your opinion, more important than the battle for Kyiv. Can you explain why that is?
Okay, so I'll just lay out what I mean by that. Okay, what I'm trying to say here is it's not necessarily that battle in Chernihiv was more important overall than the battle in Kiev Oblast. We're talking about Brovary, Irpin, Bucha. What I more wanted to express is that a lot of the events in the first couple of months of the war, there is this standard narrative mainly in the West, to be honest, because Ukrainians obviously understand their history a little bit better than the rest of us, of what happened in those early months. And one of the things that happened in the battles and so what I'm more trying to say is relative to the importance of that battle has not been discussed nearly to the extent as the Battle of Kiev has, nor for that matter has the Battle of Sumy. Now, I want to stress again, this is not discussed in the West. And I have to say that, I've written, what I've done is the second chapter of my book is basically, it's called The Invasion of Northern Ukraine, because I'm looking at the battle as a wider theatre that wasn't just, everybody, I think, that followed the conflict has those indelible memories in their mind of, Zelensky on his phone, President Tut, and, the president is here and his cabinet is here, with that little selfie video in the centre of Kiev. Everyone remembers, for instance, the blown up bridge in Irpin and the desperate refugees fleeing there, and people remember, the Zelensky walking into Bucha and that horrible look on his face when he was seeing the bodies on the ground. These are all very important and absolutely necessary stories to tell, but they are not the only stories that happened in the first couple of months in the war. Now, the attack on Kiev was really a three-pronged attack. There was the attack that came down from Belarus through Chernobyl and down to Irpin and Bucha. It spread out a bit further west and got towards near Borodyanka. But there was an equally large assault actually that came down towards Chernihiv. That was a huge. The Russians had an armored column coming towards Chernihiv that was almost as big as the one that came towards Kiev. And at the very, very start of the war, the Ukrainians really only, again like Kiev, only had a single brigade really that was manning that area. Then there was also the approach towards Sumy. Sumy had 50 professional soldiers stationed inside the city when the Russians attacked. Now, to be clear, they expected basically to just walk through the city completely unopposed. Yet so many of those people sort of grabbed Molotov cocktails, grabbed guns out of a police armory, and, what the Russians tried to do is they basically, after they didn't get into the city unopposed, they went right across, it's an almost 200-mile stretch from the border near Kursk, actually kind of ironically enough, it's the very part that Ukraine occupies now, down towards Kiev. There was this huge big column stretched out. And so the Ukrainians would sally forth from Sumy in these tiny little, divisions of people that were, had basically robbed police armories and stuff for grenades, and they would smash the Russian column and absolutely wreck their logistics. They called them gut punchers, and there's a really good documentary actually by a Ukrainian filmmaker. It's called The Gut Punch. It's about the Battle of Sumy. There's another really interesting 3-part documentary series on the Battle of Chernihiv that was done by Suspilne Chernihiv. Both of those have English have English dubbing, and they're really, really worth watching if you want to get a better overall picture of those battles. However, again, everyone remembers those battles in Kiev, but these battles in Chernihiv and Sumy in particular have basically been forgotten in the standard narrative of the war. And one of the things I would quite like to do is be able to, if you read my book, you get, it's not a detailed military history of every single engagement, but I want to tell a few of those stories that are untold in the West. And as I said, I'm not taking any original credit for having done, brilliant original research here. All of this is available in Ukrainian sources that they themselves have translated into English. So I'm very much just, also I went on a research trip to Chernihiv last week, and there are a number of soldiers who've written some quite gripping and fantastic memoirs about their service. And again, it's one of those really exciting battles. The Russians almost encircled the city completely, and at the very end, the Ukrainians were reduced to sort of ferrying the last supplies across a tiny little river that would come under artillery fire all the time. I met one of the soldiers who was doing that, who was hit in the leg by a mortar, and still managed to get the last supplies across the river before he was evacuated. And again, these are I just feel these are important stories that should be told to give people a wider overall context. These kind of battles, by the way, and these sort of misconceptions about the start of the war happened all over Ukraine, for instance. So in another little battle I'd like to draw attention to is in Kherson, because there's a very, very big perception, at least in... to be honest, it was in Ukraine as well, that people in Kherson simply handed the keys of the city over to the Russians in the first week of the war without a fight. No, actually, there was a small territorial defense unit, there's only about 50 guys, that put up a fight and held the Russians off for about a day. And I want to kind of remind people that there are sort of unsung heroes of the sort that we know about in Kiev, but these happened all over Ukraine, and they're all an important part of Ukraine's story, not just in the first months, but in the coming months as well.
Thank you, Tom. Let's go to our final thoughts now. Dom, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks, Adélie. I would just point folks, if they had time, to an article in today's paper and online as well by our colleague Ambrose Evans Pritchard. It's in the business section of today's paper, titled European Rearmament is Going to Turn the World Upside Down. It chimes with a lot of the conversations we've had in this in the last hour or so. Now, Ambrose says it's taken 3 years, but Europe is at last putting its collective economy on an industrial war footing. He references the German 400 billion euro defence spending plan that I tried to make sense of earlier, and Ursula von der Leyen's 800 billion euro Rearm Europe plan that she announced at the weekend. Now, Ambrose says all this spending, including ideas about pointing moribund sectors of the European economy, such as the car industry, towards defence output, are, as he says, the coming boom in Europe that we should all be betting on. He says it was the Second World War and not the New Deal that lifted America out of the Great Depression. And he goes on, military revival could do much the same for a Europe trapped in economic defeatism and learned helplessness for 2 decades. The moral of the story is that Europe can kill 2 birds with 1 stone, defeating perma-slump at home and Putin's predatory imperialism abroad at the same time. Now, he finishes on a rather sobering, if not chilling note. He says non-US NATO has a combined GDP of $30 trillion, 14 times the size of the Russian economy. He says the coalition of the willing must now act with lightning speed, otherwise Putin may be tempted to strike while he has a perishable advantage. We are approaching, Ambrose says, the point of maximum danger. We've put a link in the episode notes for today, folks. Have a look at that.
Thanks, Dom. Francis?
Thanks, Adélie. Just a very brief one from me. So many of you have written in, especially from the United States, asking what more you can do to support Ukraine, to support us, and to support the cause more widely. Thank you. We hear you. Stay tuned on that. In the interim, I would suggest one small thing we can all do, and that's battling the bots. Recently, there's been a huge uptick in fake Russian spam accounts posting disinformation and seeking to manipulate the information space. So if you're on comment boards, in the comments on YouTube, anywhere where you see those kind of comments, don't give them the air to breathe. Again, this isn't about censoring views. It's about throwing a damp cloth over posts that are deliberately designed to mislead. Propaganda, in other words. Right now, it's very easy to feel downhearted and alone. But the silent majority are with you. Don't let our politicians think otherwise.
Thank you. And Tom, do you want to have the final word?
Absolutely, I'd love to, and I'm going to follow off on those comments. So, Francis, that is really important, what he just said. I had a tweet, actually, the other day where I ended up going more viral than any other tweet I'd ever had, where I basically said, I feel like Trump has slightly overplayed his hand with Zelensky, simply because Zelensky is one of the, there's no little Marco or low energy jib taunt that Trump can get that will sort of diminish Zelensky's aura and the mana he's collected from being one of the world's most famous war leaders for the last 3 years. In New Zealand Maori, we have the concept of mana, which is a respect that can only be earned by a leader over a long period of time through personal sacrifices and struggling. And it's very, very hard to tarnish that. And Donald Trump, someone who was, dodged his own draft back a long time ago, is not one of the people who can put Zelensky down like that and not come out looking like a bit of a jealous sore loser. So even if Zelensky was unwise in the way he approached the summit, and I don't think he was particularly bad, it didn't look good on Trump and Vance as well. And so I think it's important that the Wall Street Journal did a small opinion piece saying, look, even the majority of Republican primary voters still see the Russians as the main aggressor here, in opposition to their own party leader, who in some cases they follow almost slavishly on all other issues. So I do think most people do support Ukraine. But that tweet, as I said, got a huge, it got something like 18,000 comments, many of which were very obvious bots that sort of posted these, one of the things you look for is their English is almost completely misspelled and terrible, and they just say Zelensky, CIA, NATO, biolab, blah, 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 and go on and on and on. I also think it's important to push back not just against bots, but people that really should know better. And one of the people here who's been absolutely awful at this is Tucker Carlson, who at least supposedly is supposed to be a journalist, posting things like the Ukrainians have been giving weapons to the Mexican cartels or to Hamas, or I'm sorry, have you seen Mexican cartels raining down, M777 artillery shells on the US border to try and, get a hole for fentanyl to come in? And his excuse? Oh, it's just well known. I travel outside the country. Well, we know where he's been recently, in Moscow, and I've heard it said. There you go. And I think it's just very, very, very depressing for someone who calls themselves a journalist to just be willing to make these absolutely incendiary claims without the tiniest shred of evidence. People complained about the mainstream media and fake news for so long. And, Elon Musk said to X, you are the media now. You are the news now. I think that's where that approach is wearing out its welcome really, really quickly. And I will just say, finally, to toot my own horn, if you want to know what I think about basically everything on the war, my book is The Dogs of Mariupol, and provided that I get the manuscript in on time, which is in about 24 hours, you'll be able to order it from Biteback, and it will be coming out in mid-May. So again, thank you very much for listening, and Adélie, thanks for your questions, and Dom and Francis, thank you very much for having me in the studio.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine, the latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So, if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review. It really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Alexis Ademora. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.